Right. Well, it's good to see you again, Erin. It's been a while, I know.
Yeah.
So let me go on ahead and introduce you all to everyone. So presenting for us at this moment is Dr. Erin Rowland Carlin. Do you prefer Dr. Rowland or Dr. Carlin or Dr. Rowland Carlin?
Dr. Carlin's fine. That'll be fine.
Okay. And Dr. Carlin is currently an instructor of political science at Eastern Illinois University. She, in fact, attended the University of Tennessee alongside me. In fact, we shared many common classes with one another. So I'm proud to say that Dr. Carlin is a very good personal friend of mine. And basically what her research tends to focus on security issues related to Eastern Europe and Russia, mostly with the foreign Soviet Union. And today she's going to be presenting the following talk: the Russia-Ukraine crisis. What does Putin want and why? So without further ado, let me go on ahead and let Dr. Carlin take the floor.
Great. And can I share slides? Do you have me enabled?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. All right, let me do that. And I'm gonna share slides for the moment, but then I also have a video that I'm going to pop up for you all. And I will say this too, I've found that there's a lot of questions that people have about what is happening in Russia and Ukraine. So I know that the directives for this talk were to leave like 15 minutes for questioning at the end, but I actually may try to work in a little bit more time on questions so that you all can ask some of those burning questions that you have on your mind. I also have a short video that I thought was great from CNN that I'm going to share with you all regarding like the different ways that were initially thought that Putin could end this conflict in Ukraine, and which direction he is most likely to go at this point. Just to give you all a bit about my own professional background and why I speak on this topic. First off, as Andrew shared, thank you so much. I have a PhD from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. And whenever I first started out, I was trying to figure out exactly what it is that my area of specialty was, but I found that it kept kind of coming back to all of these questions around not only US securities abroad or security policies abroad or foreign policies related to security abroad, but also domestic security. So in my research, I look at both conflict mediation. I do a lot of data collecting on that, but I also do domestically a lot of data collecting, and I'm starting to write papers too on active shooter incidents. So just anything around security. But this kind of comes out of too, as a young person, I grew up with parents who, and I know some of you all can identify with this, but I grew up with parents who had gone through the Cuban Missile Crisis and were very terrified about being so close to Oak Ridge during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some of you all can understand that. I remember my mother saying, and I don't know where she got her information from, but that Oak Ridge was like number 6 on the international hit list, and that they grew up, you know, with the whole drills to duck and cover in case there was a nuclear explosion. So I was always fascinated as a young child, like after the fall of the Soviet Union, of still what kind of threat was Russia. And also too, there was a lot, if you all aren't aware of this, there was a lot of nuclear remnants in the former Soviet Union that ended up in various countries. There was a lot of military intelligence that was sold off from those post-Soviet states, or even Russia itself, whenever there was this rapid change from or change to a capitalist economy. So there was always questions around, again, security, military intelligence, and how does the US handle this? And sorry, I'm just realizing I had polities on my mind instead of policies there. I did my bachelor's degree in international relations at Middle Tennessee State University and was very fortunate to study under Dr. Andrei Korbakov there. This is a professor who we don't hear much about in the political science and public administration rings in the the United States because he tends to publish in Russian, but he had a lot of interesting things to share about motivation with the Soviet Union and with Russia, and and what all was behind a lot of the internal politics, because we in IR and comparative like to say we didn't really anticipate this whole fall of the Soviet Union, whereas people who were within the Soviet Union could talk to you about what occurred back and forth over the years that led up to that. And so I'll share a bit on that. So yeah, overall, like I said, this leads into these interests that I share in US security policies towards Russia and the background knowledge that I have there. So just in brief, what I want to go over today is a little bit of the historic background, just a bit on Russia and Ukraine, as well as like Putin's embracing of Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin, and like who he is, what he thinks. But I really want to make sure that I talk to you about whenever we're looking at policies today or threats today that Putin is implementing. How is this related to the plight of Russian minorities abroad? Because we're seeing a lot of that rhetoric in what he is putting forth as far as justification for why he has gone in and invaded certain areas. And then we'll talk about Putin's interests regarding Russian defense and territorial expansion and how this all relates to power transition theory, which is another favorite of mine. So just very basically, under the Soviet Union, or Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, and of course we have in 1991 the fall of the Soviet Union. Part of what you would want to know, though, too, in all of this is, does anybody know, just by the way, how old Vladimir Putin is?
He is 69, correct?
Yes, 69 years old. So whenever he's growing up, he would remember very much that power challenge back and forth between the United States and the Soviet Union. He would remember kind of like this height, in a way, of the respect of the Soviet Empire around the world, or fear. But, the Soviet Union was taken very seriously at this point in the world. He rose through the ranks of the KGB, and became a person of power then. And if you read, and one of the books that I'll reference a lot here in this presentation is Putins Kleptocracy, and that's KLEPTOCRACY. But if you read Putin's Kleptocracy, there have been, or the author of that book did some investigative journalism into people who or interviewed people who were either former members of Putin's inner circle or people who had been moles placed by the West into Putin's inner circle, as well as journalists who, investigative journalists in Russia who followed a lot of what Putin did. But he discovered a lot regarding Putin's both motivations as well as what he was seeking policy-wise as far as like Russian expansion again. And they talk quite a bit about, Putin during his time as a KGB agent. I don't think they can really tie him exactly to any incidents that he specifically committed, but there are a lot of people that will say he was absolutely involved in assassinations. He was like a tough, scary dude whenever it came to that. So he is a tough guy. He is a strong man in many of the classic senses. So he would have risen through all of that and felt like, probably that he had reached a point to where under the Soviet Union that he was going to have a bright future and career ahead. But then we have this fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, and on the world stage, to kind of quote Dr. Krista Wiegand from UT, who spoke on this a few weeks ago, on the world stage, Russia and Putin later on would feel very humiliated, okay? That they had been very humiliated on the world stage. They had been promised in a way by Reagan, or Gorbachev had, that the United States and the West were going to lead them to this bright and shining, or lead them along the bright and shining pathway towards capitalism where they would be very prosperous, right? And instead, the Soviet Union collapses, Reagan is soon out of office, and the United States, attention turns under George H.W. Bush, so that's senior for those of you all who are younger, but attention shifts to looking at, or dealing with instead like the hostage crisis in Iran. And so Russia and a lot of these post-Soviet states are kind of forgotten. So again, that goes back to this whole humiliation that Russia and even Putin himself would feel towards what occurred with the West. Now, whenever we turn to Ukraine, there's back and forth about like areas that were of Russia that were given to Ukraine, like Crimea, and did that still belong to Russia, or were we supposed to follow along? Or was the world supposed to follow along still with these territorial boundaries that had been established decades before? So there's a lot of argument and confusion with Russia about that, but there is this, and this is expressed a bit in the CNN video, there is this cultural belief in a way that the historic ties of the Russian people are to Kiev. And by the way, I say Kiev instead of Kiev because Kiev is the way that it's pronounced in Ukrainian. Kiev is the Russian pronunciation. So in solidarity and support with the Ukrainian people, Kiev is the pronunciation that I'm adopting in this. So Kiev was the heart of this Russian culture and like the ancestral home of the Russian culture hundreds of years before. And so there is this idea of wanting to reclaim Kiev, wanting to reclaim that historical part of Russia. There has been profession that Russia and Ukraine do not exist separately, even as late as like a week ago, that they only exist together. So that's a big part of what's been going on over there. And then just keep in mind, and I'm just touching on this for a moment, but keep in mind too, that there is also this continued rhetoric from Vladimir Putin that they're trying to rescue these Russian minorities in Ukraine that have experienced genocide. And that's what's led to a lot of his rhetoric regarding denazifying or Ukraine or getting rid of like fascist groups there. It's all about this whole Russian minority question. And of course, we do know from a lot of international watchdogs that these claims from Russia are unfounded. So if there's been any question in your mind about that, we have from many, many different sources that these are unfounded. Now, another big part of understanding Vladimir Putin, and this is important, and some will say Alexander Dugin here, that whose name I have on the screen, that he's given too much credit sometimes for Putin's decisions that he makes. I find though that it is important to understand at least Putin's partial buy-in to Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin. And I have just a few quotes that I want to share with you from a bit about him. So Alexander Dugin is a modern Russian philosopher. I believe he's a little bit younger than Putin. And he has called for the rebuilding of the Soviet Union in a way. He calls it a neo-Russian empire. So this new Russian empire, and he has espoused this as the manifest destiny, like think of in the United States, their manifest destiny of controlling land from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. He has claimed that it's Russia's manifest destiny in a way to recontrol all of these post-Soviet states, all of those areas. And of course, there are specific ones that they pay more attention to. Also, he sees a lot of Western culture as demonic and routinely espouses this. This is interesting too. In recent years, as we've seen Russia working its politics around the globe, we have seen rhetoric coming from Putin himself, as you know, as well as the higher elite in Russia, that Russia is the major power to turn to if you are a country that doesn't like to follow the United States or the rest of the West and their leadership. They're the power to align with, they're the power to follow, and that while they may be Christian through the Russian Orthodox denomination, that they are far more conservative than Christians would, or Christian denominations would claim to be in the United States or the West. So they have presented themselves as this more conservative, while Christian, this more conservative religiously country option or major power option for other countries like in the Middle East to align with. Also, too, Alexander Dugin routinely has said that Russia is closer to Asia than it is to Europe. And so he envisions Russia as being more Eurasian in a way. And let me see here. This is part of the quote that I wanted to read to you. So it says, according to Dugan, the forces of liberal and capitalist Western civilization represent what the ancient Greeks called the essential form of Titanism, or the anti-ideal form, which, quote, opposes heaven. In other words, the West would summarize the revolt of the earth against heaven. And he calls the West atomizing universalism and apophatic universalism expressed in the political idea of empire. He says that values of democracy, human rights, and individualism are not universal, but uniquely Western. So let me say that again. Ideas of democracy, human rights, and individualism are not universal, but they're uniquely Western. So those liberal concepts, and we talk about in political science, realism versus liberalism or liberal institutionalism, but a lot of those liberalist concepts of individualism and human rights, that's anathema to some of what Russia espouses. And you combine that again with this connection to projecting themselves as this conservative choice, this conservative major power option. And it all kind of starts coming together or making sense as far as like how Putin is trying to sell Russia to other countries around the world. There was something else I was going to say on that. It might come back to me in just a moment. Oh, yes, I did want to note one more connection to Kyiv. The Russians not only believe that Kyiv in a way is like the ancestral home of their people, but it's also connected to like the home of Russian Orthodoxy as well. So whenever we turn to this whole question about Russian minorities, the fall of the Soviet Union, what occurred there, and how is this rhetoric still being used today? So there was this ability, well, let me back up and say this. After the Bolshevik Revolution, under Tsarist Russia, we had like this prison of certain nations that have been conquered or brought into Tsarist Russia. And there was this idea that some of these nations, that they should be allowed to embrace their own language, their own cultures. On the other hand, there was this idea that instead, no, that there should be Russification of these countries. And what does that mean exactly? Well, most of my research on Russian minorities has been around the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And it was this concept that if or Russification was this concept that if you were going to have a good job in the country under Soviet Russia, that you had to learn Russian. And there were different periods too where children are forced to learn in Russian in school. They could not learn in their native language. There was a lot of stripping away of Estonian, Latvian, or Lithuanian culture in the Baltics, but this happened elsewhere. On the other hand, though, you would have certain leaders that would come to power over the years in the Soviet Union that would instead return to this promotion of self-identity, of one's culture, of one's language. Like I said, you can then educate your children in your language of your country or your ethnic group. So it was this back and forth, and I like to think of it mentally as just taking like maybe a plastic rod and bending it back and forth until it broke. Because there were periods where this Russification was very harsh. Like under Stalin, we had purges, deportations, settlement efforts where people from Russia were asked to go to these other countries to move in there. And if you were going to be in local level leadership, or maybe on up at like the state level of leadership, you had to be Russian. If you were going to be the head person of any companies or corporations, you had to be Russian, like native Russian. So there were settlement efforts where these people were moved there, they were put into power. And again, under Stalin, there was that great push towards Russian language only. Khrushchev comes in, there's an accommodationist stance. And I say this too because another important thing to understand is the countries on the western part of the Soviet Union, eastern part of Europe, so like the Baltics, Ukraine, on down through there, these countries were often treated more harshly than the countries on the eastern side of Russia, like you're in the stance. So there are times too whenever the countries in the east are given more ability to self-determine and more ability to utilize their own language and to hold positions of power, while over on the western edge of the Soviet Empire, there are crackdowns. And so this is seen as very unfair by a lot of those countries or even particular ethnic groups. With Brezhnev, whenever Brezhnev took power, he said that a Soviet republic had been created, a Soviet people had been created. So there was no more need for Russification, that the problem had been solved, and that they could also abandon any policy attempts for socioeconomic equality, because you had a lot of these ethnic groups that were crying out that they were being treated unequally. They didn't have the same opportunities as ethnic Russians. And so Brezhnev went about just more of like with assimilation policies. And again, there too, we see where Central Asia, those Central Asian countries were favored, and where there was a lot of implementation of corruption at that point into the Soviet Empire. So by the time that we get to Gorbachev, this back and forth of allowing self-identity versus Russification, back and forth, this is what many researchers from within post-Soviet states will say helps lead up to a lot of the cries for independence and the eventual fall of the Soviet Union. So sorry, let me go back 1 second. How does this play into what Putin wants and what he's after? Whenever the Soviet Union falls, you have some of these Russians who are left over from these settlement efforts into these other post-Soviet states. And they might have been there now at this point for 2 or sometimes 3 generations. And a lot of these former post-Soviet states, especially former Soviet states, especially in the west of the former Soviet Empire, tell them, and not so politely, get out, leave, go on back to Russia. Or if you want to stay, you can stay, but you're not going to be in these positions of power anymore. And now, whenever your children go to school, they're not going to learn in the Russian language. They're going to learn in Ukrainian, or they're going to learn in Estonian or Latvian or Lithuanian languages. And if you're not happy with it, again, leave. Some were offered citizenship status more quickly than in other countries. Some today, some of these Russian minorities today, like in Latvia and Lithuania, do not have much political voice, versus in Estonia, where Estonia has given the Russian minority a large voice. It's caused a bit of problems with them, with Russia and with Putin, because he routinely points to a lot of the rhetoric coming from these Russian minorities as justification for, oh, Russia needs to go in at some point and rescue these people, that by rescuing them, we will also go in and annex the land where they're living. But that land may not always line up with exactly what he wants to annex or where. So just keep that in mind, and we'll come back to that thought. So at this point, I want to switch over just a moment to have this CNN video that talks, it's really short, but it talks about Putin's interest in Crimea and what was being theorized 3 or 4 weeks ago about what Putin could possibly choose to do regarding the invasion in Ukraine. So let me stop my sharing and switch over to that just a moment. Well, they've taken down their video. Sorry, I thought I had it right here, but it's instead got short word, long word. I should have said they've taken down their video. They've changed it a little bit, but I'll just go back to the screen then, because this also covers the 5 different options. Just a moment. Okay. So initially, one of the thoughts was that that Putin would just step in and he would take the Donbas region on, or that Russia borders on eastern Ukraine, and that so those 2 states over there that have declared themselves independent, that he would go in and take that region, and so that would be the first option. However, there is this area that of land that connects down to Crimea. And so the second option that a lot of people were fearing was that he would take the Donbas region and that he would push troops up from Crimea, and that he would try to take that whole land corridor between the 2 areas. And this is why we've seen a lot of intense fighting in Mariupol. So if you all have been watching the news footage and all of that, there's been a lot of destruction and siege of Mariupol to the point to where the town is almost entirely destroyed. And the Russian troops have been really loath to give any land or any positions down in that area. So it seems like he's really after right now this land region to connect it all together. And part of what this would do too is that this would connect to the ports around the Black Sea, and Putin wants those ports. There have been intentions to run energy pipelines, I believe it's natural gas pipelines, down through the Black Sea. He also just wants the shipping ports as well. This has been professed by a lot of his inner circle over recent years. And they actually, even in Putin's kleptocracy, I believe it noted that Ukraine was the first place, or the upcoming place, I guess first place, like in our current history, that he wanted to turn to. And if he was successful there, that he wanted to go after annexing areas around the pipelines that go through the Baltic states next. So Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And that's why we've seen a lot of nervousness coming out of those countries. The third potential option was that Putin would push all the way to about the center mark-ish of Ukraine, and he would take the whole eastern half of Ukraine as well as Kyiv. And again, it was that whole cultural connection of the Russian people, but also of the Russian Orthodox Church. So they wanted Kyiv symbolically. And it seems like that very much may have been his intentions, was number three, until he's been met with so much resistance and problems with troop movement into eastern Ukraine and trying to push into heavily fortified Kyiv. So it may be that he really wanted option three, and sorry, that should say four there, that he really wanted option three, but instead he's having to maybe fall back to option two. And of course, too, there's also the question about demilitarization and neutral status and not joining NATO. There's all those questions as well. Of course, there's the fourth option that Putin could have just taken the whole country. And I don't know if any of you all got to see the video that was posted with Lukashenko that made its rounds on social media, but there was a question with Lukashenko, did he accidentally give away the intents to quarter the country into two regions in the east belonging to Russia and two regions in the west belonging to Belarus? So there was a potential agreement there that was made, and there was this video that Lukashenko posted of him talking to a few of his top generals. He sent out to basically national media. But what else was very interesting in this is that there were arrows on the map down at the bottom that, to my knowledge, he did not cover, but in his talk, but that did show potential movement of troops into Moldova. So again, we come back to this possibility of, well, if we're successful in Ukraine, let's continue pushing on and taking some of these other former Soviet states. So power transition, how does all of this relate into, and this is an area that I really like to talk about, but how does this all relate into power transition? We have three specialists on this at different points have written together in international relations, Organsky, Kugler, and Lemke. And this will kind of lead into a wrap up, but Organsky, Kugler, and Lemke have done a lot of research on global power transition whenever we move from one superpower to another. And we know kind of in power transition that the global environment goes through this period where you have like a major superpower, and that superpower ends up, in order to keep the world a peaceful place, it keeps up extending its economics and extending its military further and further and further abroad, and is having to fund this extensive military that reaches throughout its empire, is having to engage in like local politics and maintaining local politics, or in the more modern era, state level politics. I'm thinking back to the Roman Empire. But it's getting stretched thin with that, is having to economically provide for all of these areas, is having to defend all of these areas, both internally or from internal threats as well as external threats. And so at some point, the superpower or the hegemon becomes overextended, and it has to draw back because there starts being calls for more help at home. you know, in the main state, especially more economic help. Why are we wasting all this money on the far reaches of our empire whenever our citizens and people need help right here at home? So as it pulls away, there's power vacuums that are created. And Organski, Kugler, and Lemke also talk about this difference between satisfied and dissatisfied states. And let me make sure that I help you all wrap your minds conceptually around this. Satisfied states, they classify states that are currently satisfied, maybe not completely happy, but they're satisfied with the status quo of who the superpower is that is in charge. Dissatisfied states are the ones that want to see change. They want to see regime change. And so as the superpower is starting to experience like overextension of itself and it starts pulling back and pulling towards its center, then this allows for the rise of other challenging powers or challenging states. And what is interesting is Organski, Kugler, and Lemke show through their research that throughout history, it's not necessarily been the number one strongest challenging state or dissatisfied state that has risen up to try to battle against the current superpower, the current hegemon. It's actually been the number two most powerful state. So the question is, and we could argue, you know, who's more powerful if you put together both military and economics as well as like political might, who's more powerful, China or Russia? But we know that for quite a while that a lot of analysts have been saying that by like 2040, probably at the latest, that China would likely slide into the lead role or the leadership role as the superpower in the global environment. And as Organski, Kugler, and Lemke put forth, these power transitions have never happened without a major war. So the question was, though, in this modern era, were we going to see wars like we'd seen before? Greece versus Rome, or the Grecian Empire versus the Roman Empire, you know, battles between Britain and Spain. Were we going to see World War I or World War II again? And so a lot of people were hoping that there would be a shift to, or people who study security policies, they were hoping that there would be this shift to probably more cyber warfare. And that's part of what's gone on, but we've also had like a proxy war situation. So there is this question among power transition theorists of, are we starting to see number two challenger Russia challenging the United States? And what usually occurs is that they will spend a lot of their efforts economically and militarily challenging one another. And really it comes down to the financial dollar. They overextend themselves financially to where the number one dissatisfied state sits back, tries to remain neutral, tries not to get too involved. And as the other two basically wear themselves out, the number one challenging state slides into the role as the global hegemon. And we have seen this in regional hegemon theory too, in certain regions of the world as well. So just keep that in mind. So with that being said, that kind of helps wrap a lot of this up, but we, you know, I just wanted to return one more time to, again, that question about Russian minorities. And here's where we see Putin continuing to use that language around we're trying to rescue these Russian minorities. We're trying to save them from these terrible things that are happening to them. And we're going to use that rhetoric as justification for why we're moving into these particular regions, which are actually kind of strategic for us and which we want. I can also talk about like the nuclear element with all of this, and the security element as far as like what Russia was wanting or not wanting in regards to Ukraine joining NATO. But yeah, there was one other element on that. But I'll open it up right now. What questions do you all have that I can answer for you too?
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Carlin. I have a particular question as well for you. I'm still a little confused as to, I kind of asked it earlier in chat, but I was wondering, isn't Kyiv technically the historical capital of Kievan Rus, which was the predecessor to the modern Russian state?
Yes, yes. So,
can you tell me a little bit about sort of the significance of Kievan Rus to the modern Russian state?
You know, that's one area I'll admit my own ignorance on that, because more of my knowledge is is around Russian history, like the actual history of Russia all the way back to like Ivan the Terrible. But you are right in that, and that's an area where I am limited. So yes, I will say that, Andrew.
Any other questions? Let's see. It looks like Anita Black here asked the following question. Are there many small countries that will follow Russia and increase Russia's power over the United States and our allies? I'm guessing maybe besides Belarus, of course.
That's a great question. So, and I have my own thoughts on that. I know it finally jolted in my memory what else I was wanting to point out to, and just to let you know where some of these answers are coming from. I've been following Russia Today, RT America, since probably back in 2013, 2014, whenever I was a student at the University of Tennessee, and then later as I was TAing for courses there, we would often put on RT America and just kind of listen to the crazy spin that's being put forth, sometimes by Russia, about both internal politics in the United States and, you know, and sometimes Russia was with us, sometimes they were against us. But you know, RT is one of those like Sputnik that's been limited now by Facebook and a lot of other entities. Google, you can't Google search for RT that can be found through rt.com. But I say that because I think it's very fascinating for those of us that can take it with all the skepticism it deserves of the messages that are being put forth. You can go and you can watch this and you can see what Putin is saying, and you can see what the Russian state media is saying. And they do believe right now that they have Iran as an ally. I do think that they will try in some ways to continue to coordinate with part of the Middle East regarding oil exports and, you know, kind of offsetting some of the sanctions from Russia. I do think too that there is a concern, of a major concern, as we all know, of China being a sanctions buster. So are they going to publicly say, we're not necessarily supporting Russia, but then going ahead and continuing to engage with them with both buying energy exports, but also like furthering their trade relationship? Because during the Olympics, of course, Putin and President Xi met, and they, you know, they made this public statement about them being trade partners and friends that know no ends, right? And committed to like this 30 or 40 year trade partnership agreement. But again, it was this idea though that their partnership would know no ends. And there are a lot of questions around too. Was China waiting to see how all of this unfolded with Russia and Ukraine to determine whether or not they would go into Taiwan? And there was information that was accidentally released. It was, or in China, it was like directions to the media that were accidentally released or circulated. It was telling state media there to not say anything negative about Russia, but to not overtly appear to the West that they were supporting them either, but for sure not to chastise Russia, because they would need Russia whenever it came to Taiwan. So whenever we talk about small countries, yes, that's part of who we can look to. Also, and his name leaves me for the moment, but there's there's an older leader in Kazakhstan, and Putin has already told him, you do understand that whenever you pass, that Russia is going to annex Kazakhstan. You're going to be part of us. And so they have kind of this, we might say, gentleman's agreement that Kazakhstan's going to be consumed back into Russia. So we see that empire rebuilding there.
Thank
of course,
you.
there's Syria too, you know.
True. I have another question from Stephen Adkins. So what has been the general U.S. response to these recent events, and what do the two major political parties seem to be seeking out of either Ukraine or Russia?
I think this has been an interesting area where we've had a lot of united response, say for just how far, like you see some rhetoric on the right, more so comes through, I guess, maybe in the media, but some rhetoric on the right as far as like, how far do we sacrifice ourselves economically with inflation already on the rise and there a looming recession, in paying at the pump for all of this? Like, it's kind of like the rhetoric on the right has been one of support, but one that's maybe in favor in some circles, especially in the media, of being more aggressive militarily and, you know, and putting less pressure on the pocketbook at home. On the other hand, you see like a lot of support, I believe, on the left for the pathway that Biden has chosen. And I will say this, I think there's many too on the right that see, especially like within the Foreign Services Committee, to see a lot of the decisions that he has made regarding this pathway of like supporting Ukraine through weapon shipments, but not putting any boots on the ground, as the appropriate one to take. Now, occasionally too, though, there's been Biden that's like maybe in some circles he said too much off the cuff, you know, like calling Putin a butcher last week. And they're like, oh no, don't say that, or like calling for regime change. And you got to think about the political ramifications of that. So I think we do, those of us who are in the know with political science, we do see that there's a lot of calculations going into every bit of the decisions that are being made and rhetoric put forth. We don't put boots on the ground because Ukraine's not a NATO country. If we accepted them into NATO, we would have to put boots on the ground. And it would put, like if we try to close the skies over Ukraine, then that would mean NATO states, including the United States, shooting down or potentially shooting down Russian fighter jets. So we're trying to keep from putting ourselves in that situation to where then things can escalate quickly and become uncertain. And I will tell you, as somebody too that studied a lot about nuclear security politics, there is also a concern that we say, well, would Russia use nuclear weapons? I don't think that we would, my 2 cents, I don't think that we would necessarily see Russia trying to launch nuclear weapons unless, you know, there was this whole mutually assured destruction event where they felt like they were being attacked. More so of concern, and again, this is something that Organsky, Kugler, and Lemke mentioned, is tactical nuclear weapons. We have smaller nuclear weapons technologies, you know, nuclear states, or a lot of the nuclear states do, called blockbusters, where you can create mushroom cloud about the size of a city block. And they have been used on the battlefield. We're concerned about chemical and biological weapons deployments. But another concern, and I, as a nuclear person too, I kept watching this, was there were reports that basically that Russia was going to allow Chernobyl to suffer another meltdown and contaminate the area. Of course, that would have affected their friend Belarus, but would they allow that to occur? Would they hold part of the EU hostage with potential fallout from that, you know, like if the fallout drifted? But also, like I said, there were reports that the Russian troops were laying landmines around Chernobyl. So lots of questions and concerns there as far as like what might be intention. So I don't think it would be, like I said, this direct major nuclear weapons attack. I think it would be more strategic and scarier, with these small weapons.
Okay, thank you. I've got another question from Anita Black. So what do you think Putin's overall purpose is? Is he interested in outdoing his predecessors, I presume from the Soviet Union?
I don't know how much Putin wants to go down in history, he himself, from what we know about his rhetoric, as he more conceptually buys into this concept of rebuilding Russia as a major power that is a force to be reckoned with and not a joke anymore. It's in many ways he sees his remaining in a position of power in Russia as the way that Russia reclaims its status. So, yeah, I think he enjoys it, but it's a way to reclaim Russia's status in the world. There are, in some ways, very real frustrations regarding the expansion of NATO closer to Russia. As one person put it in another panel I was in, it would be in some ways like saying, okay, Russia's going to bring nuclear weapons and military forces into Mexico. And how willing would we be to accept that here in the United States? Also, too, I think there's been a miscalculation on Russia's part. And I think a lot of this has to do, just me personally, I think a lot of this has to do with underestimating Zelensky and our response to Zelensky. That I heard it put by Dr. Matthew Croston, who is incoming director of the Institute of National Security and Military Studies at Austin Peay. I heard it put forth by him that that Russia, they believe in this philosophy of power, and they believe too that the United States bought into that, and they need only point back to Iraq and Afghanistan to say, okay, we saw some of the things you did, and while we don't necessarily agree with it, as a major power country, we can go along with you have this major position of power in the UN and around the globe to go in and enact your will in certain places. And so they, in some ways, thought that they would also be allowed to do what they did in Ukraine, because that's in their backyard. And we're going to go in and we're going to reclaim this area. What I think, and we've talked about right now, I'll share with you all, I created a diplomacy lab partnership, or I got approved a diplomacy lab partnership between the U.S. State Department and Eastern Illinois University, where I teach at right now. And over spring break, we had a last minute project that came across my emails, an opportunity, and we got the opportunity to work with the Office of Refugee Admissions. And so we're working alongside them right now. But one of the questions that my students and I have asked or discussed is why didn't we pay this much attention to the atrocities that were committed in Syria? Why haven't we paid this much attention to some of the atrocities that have been committed in Venezuela or in areas of Africa? Why not there? And I said, well, there could be this aspect related to race. There could be this aspect related to many people speaking English and putting forth their stories on social media. There could be maybe a religious connection in a way to where more attention is given to this crisis of people are better able to, domestic audiences are better able somehow to identify. But I also said, I don't know how many some of these previous refugee movements had a Zelensky. Because Zelensky came from, their version of Hollywood. He was an actor, and his wife, if you all do not know, she was a scriptwriter. So a lot of what they've put forth, even like there is a 3 almost 4 minute video that was shown to the joint houses of the legislature, and Zelensky and his team put it together. I'm sure his wife was probably involved in the script, but they showed these beautiful pictures of all these Ukrainian cities before these attacks. And interspersed in between them were these cities being hit by these bombs. And they were, there were pictures of soldiers holding crying children, or there were also medical doctors trying to work on these children that were dying. I know some of the children that were referenced in this video were ones that passed away. And so Zelensky has been really great, I believe, at putting forth that message to the West to get domestic audiences to buy in, not just the legislatures, not just the leaders, but to get a lot of us to care about what's going on and stopping it. And so for democratic countries, that becomes easier for a leadership and all your major parties to get behind supporting.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more follow-up question. It looks like Anita Black also asked, how do you see the US responding if Russia continues to press in through Ukraine? Do you think they're going to change their response at all, or do you believe we're going to keep the same response that we currently have if, let's say, Russia continues to push west?
Well, and I don't necessarily think they're done. It's like whatever Russia says, don't necessarily believe it. Like if they say that they're calling for a ceasefire in Kyiv or they're creating humanitarian corridors, don't necessarily believe it. A lot of times too, they signal ahead of time what their intentions are of doing by accusing the West or Ukraine of doing, like, oh, we think that the West has chemical weapons labs in Ukraine or biological weapons labs, and that they're going to use those on their Russian troops or on Russia. When in essence, there was fear that that's what Russia was intending to do. I think that if there were a major chemical or biological attack, you would likely see us go in. If they try to push into any NATO countries, we 100% will honor that commitment, especially with Poland. Andrew, I don't know if you remember or not, but the defense minister of Poland actually came to the Baker Center at the University of Tennessee a few years ago. And so you could tell very much that there was a lot of concern about Russia and that they did not trust Russia at all. I think that we are seeing right now, even in my interactions with the State Department, we're seeing a continued ramping up of refugee admissions. And I think that we will continue trying to find ways to funnel weapons to Ukraine. I think that probably, and it's not being announced, but I think that we'll probably continue to try to help ramp up cyber attacks. I think that's where we're going. And we want to continue with targeted sanctions of so in the weeks leading up to Russia invading Ukraine, I don't know if you all noticed or not, but there were small little news stories that were happening where President Biden was visiting Saudi Arabia, President Biden was visiting Qatar. So he, I think, was already anticipating what was going to happen, and they were trying to get everybody together to figure out how to help get the EU off of Russian energy products. And I think right now it's about like 70% of their energy resources come from Russia, or at least I think in Germany it may be 70%. So that's a big concern there. But as far as boots on the ground, I still don't see that occurring. But I think we may try to funnel more weapons, better weapons, and definitely some of those Soviet era fighter jets. We might see that occurring too, because we said with Poland, oh, we didn't say we could immediately fill orders with new fighter jets for you all if you gave them the Soviet era fighter jets that were left over in Poland from the Soviet Union from before. We can't immediately refill that, but if you give of your goodness to Ukraine, okay. So that might be where we will be going next.
All right, thank you, Erin.
You're welcome. Thank you all
for your talk, and thank you for coming today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you all for coming and listening and for inviting me to do this. yeah, I really enjoyed it.
And Dr. Carlin, where can we find out more about your work and your program?
Yes, so like I said, I'm at Eastern Illinois University. I have a web page here at Eastern Illinois, but a lot of the work that we're getting ready to put forth, that's around like active shooter incidents. And right now, so we've got a new database that we're creating on that, that we're hoping to roll out we were hoping to roll it out by the end of this semester, but it may take us into summer, and we'll be publishing some on that. The U.S. Active Shooter Incidents Database is what we're officially titling it. And we'll be at MPSA, or at least participating virtually with that next week. But also, please feel free to reach out and email me at E for Erin, V for Victoria, Rowland, ROWLAND, at eiu.edu.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for all the people that attended, asked great questions all throughout the day. And if you're watching this recording on YouTube, thank you so much. And you can always email us here to find out more about the presentations. And we look forward to seeing you again bright and early tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock.